Switch to override grid, redirect lens 9. That isn't a comet. Technician Dreven's voice cut across the control deck with an urgency that twisted heads. Red indicators flared across the overhead arcs as targeting arrays reoriented. Behind him, the reinforced blast doors trembled from the force of subsurface coolant turbines shifting into active defense protocols. General Rovan Marek leaned over the reinforced alloy table, eyes scanning the overlapping thread maps cascading across the control wall. No dramatics, no raised voice, just calculation. He shifted his weight forward, the thick underlay of his environmental armor creaking faintly as he spoke. Are we still tracking the outer shell? Yes, sir, 1,200 ships, configurations confirmed, Concord Alliance markings, no independent transponder drift. All primaries moving in orbital lock, replied Ket Doran, his operations lead, wiping condensation off the inside of his visor. The room was refrigerated to preserve the coolant matrices laced into the floor panels, and still sweat beaded on every man's brow. The heat wasn't external, it was inside them. The kind that came when you realized you were staring down a coordinated extinction protocol. Broadcast just came through, said Communications Officer Selrick, his tone strangled between disbelief and restraint. Global feed relay. This isn't a threat, it's an expiration notice. Rovan walked slowly to the receiver node. He pressed a gloved hand to the input grid and pulled the message up on the neural thread scanner, its waveform shimmering across the contact surface. The transmission was embedded with high-clearance override signals and embedded species-marking data. No question about authenticity. People of Earth, it began, the voice low, deliberate. Your accelerated advancement in antimatter drive systems, autonomous combat intelligences, and interstellar relay development has been deemed destabilizing. The Concord has voted. You have until your midnight planetary rotational standard to surrender your systems and submit to enforced stabilization measures. Rovan didn't move. The lights dimmed slightly as the bunker's lower power grid rerouted voltage to deep-sea intake batteries, preparing for potential cascade failure. Failure to comply will be considered a declaration of escalation. Concord Command stands in lunar orbit. There will be no negotiations. Selrick killed the audio. No one looked away from the screen, not even when it went dark. They're not posturing, Ket said quietly. They expect us to comply by reflex. They've misread us. Rovan spoke as if reciting a fact, not making a prediction. 1,200 ships, 47 species. They believe we're fractured. He stepped back from the scanner table, hands folding behind his back. A nearby atmospheric monitor vented a controlled hiss of recycled air, releasing the scent of sterilized copper and heated panel grease into the room. We're not fractured, we're distributed. The men around him didn't reply. They didn't need to. The general had spent 20 years adapting counterinsurgency methods into global readiness doctrine. When the Concord had first sent observation probes into Jupiter's shadow 5 years ago, Rovan's analysis predicted a preemptive strike policy by 2089. He had been off by 22 months. A burst of light flashed across the room as the topographical relay zoomed outward to lunar orbit. The conquered fleet had settled into layered formation, with command carriers marked by tetrahedral hulls and deep structural grav stabilizers projecting faint fields around their hulls. Each ship bore a saturation cannon array the size of Manhattan, Dreven muttered. Each one of those could reduce a city in seconds, and there's over 1,000. Rovan looked down at his wrist interface. One signal blinked red. The United Defense Command standby order was still pending. He tapped it. The command registered and transmitted. Around the globe, automated defense AI systems dropped to passive monitoring. Satellites ceased encrypted data emissions. Ground batteries were taken offline. Stand-down orders transmitted, said Ket. Why? Goodbye time. He didn't elaborate. Rovan left the operations chamber without another word. the door groaning open into the corridor. Frost collected on the inner seams of the passage as he stepped into the deep way, a 70-meter reinforced hallway leading toward the external observatory. His boots echoed against alloy grates as he walked, his breath fogging before dissipating into the charged air. On either side, screens displayed rotating orbital data, flickering star maps now blurred by the presence of an artificial blockade stretching across Earth's line of sight. The Concorde's formation resembled a net. They weren't here to fight a war. They were here to collect a victory. The observatory hatch opened. The reinforced glass was nearly opaque from the refracted glow of lunar reflections. Rovan approached it slowly. In the distance, across the frozen plains of the Arctic shelf, the faint shimmer of aurora bent around the upper ionosphere, warped by heat blooms from the kinetic stabilizers orbiting overhead. His eyes tracked the Concorde's primary carrier, its hull yawning like a blade pulled from sheath. "They'll aim for the reactors first," he muttered to himself. "Then water infrastructure. Then memory archives." He opened a secured link on his wrist module and transmitted a coded message to 4 buried command shelters, one in Siberia, one beneath the Andes, one under the Sahara crust, and one near the seafloor of the Pacific Rift. The message wasn't long. It didn't need to be. The recipients didn't reply. Back inside, the team waited for further orders. Drevin glanced up as the general returned, shaking frost from his shoulders. "They'll escalate within the hour," Rovan said calmly. "They believe we'll crack before the deadline." Get spoke, this time without hesitation. "Do we respond?" Rovan looked around the room. Every man there had seen enough war to know the cost of a wrong move. But sometimes it wasn't about choosing the right one. Sometimes it was about knowing which wrong ones the enemy expected you to make. No broadcasts, no deployments, no visual deterrence. Let them believe we're frozen. Until we're not. The countdown had begun. Earth had 14 hours. The first systems blinked offline at 11:03 UTC. From Seoul to Johannesburg, power routing cores staggered. Control interfaces froze. Transit hubs locked mid-sunction. Data relays surged beyond capacity. In the northern corridor of the Greenland bunker, an auxiliary reactor discharged violently, tripping alarms and slamming security gates across 2 sublevels. Rovan Marek didn't flinch. He stood at the center of the Arctic Network Command, watching the output of Earth's most critical infrastructures flood into kinetic diagnostic threads. The feedback lines weren't random. They formed a grid, a calculated attack. "They're not targeting weapons systems," said Malric Vone, his voice calm but sharpened by realization. "They're targeting continuity, civil flow, life support sectors. They want streets to collapse before any missiles fire." "They're betting on hysteria," replied Rovan, stepping between consoles and glancing at a broken data string auto-correcting itself faster than the technicians could observe. "They've studied our history, riots, fuel panics, infrastructure chain reactions. That's what they expect." A deep rumble echoed overhead. Not an explosion, too rhythmic. That was the coolant shelf repressurizing under emergency override. It meant one thing. Reroute had begun. "De Seek," Rovan called, not raising his voice. "Status of the neural thread backbone?" The encryption lead stood hunched over a fiber-burst terminal, eyes racing across shifting geometries fed directly from the quantum-integrated satellites. Each pulse showed a different topographic layer of the planet's data nervous system. They hit primary, secondary, and tertiary arrays in sequence. All 3 failed to isolate the root intelligence. He straightened up and turned, the edge of a grin barely forming. They can't locate the control node because there isn't one. The bunker's overhead status grid began flashing with realignments. Paris, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Nairobi. Cities expected to fall dark were illuminated in sequence. Emergency power stations remained untouched, rerouted autonomously. They expected Central Command. Cardethan muttered. The ex-officer's hands moved quickly as he isolated Concord's data waveforms. But we built Earth to mimic what they feared most, decentralized cognition. Malric leaned over his panel, tapping a control to overlay Concord fleet telemetry atop their interference patterns. We spent a century building AI that doesn't dominate. It echoes. They came expecting fragility, Rovan added. They'll stay long enough to learn what adaptation looks like. The overhead lighting stabilized. Emergency protocols deactivated, and the room's glow returned to operational white. The relief was immediate. Men lowered their shoulders, hands steadied over control inputs, the chaos beginning to quiet, not through orders, but through regained rhythm. Vaughn, bring me orbital feeds, filter by anomaly. Within seconds, the main projection grid filtered out standard trajectories, isolating signature disruptions across Concorde formations. Carr stepped beside Malric, narrowing his eyes. They've got synchronicity issues, Malric muttered. See that carrier drift? That's not a pilot correction, it's a timing failure. Their formations are running relay lock. Rovan didn't move. He processed it fully before replying. Tachyon thread? Yes, Tashik answered immediately, already predicting the next question. Their fleet uses phase-staggered tachyon relay to synchronize orientation and trajectory among lead units. A single offset at the source would domino across the chain. Rovan folded his arms, voice quiet. You're telling me the entire Concorde fleet balances its coordination through time-phase convergence? That's the structural vulnerability. If you break the relay's symmetry... Tessic trailed off, letting the thought finish itself. Rovan turned to Carr. How soon can we confirm whether the Aegis reactor array can deliver a modulated tachyon disruption? Carr frowned, thinking. We'll need 30 minutes minimum to calibrate, 40 if we want targeting accurate enough to force misfire without causing atmospheric reflection. If we overfire the pulse? Global satellite link disruption, communications blackout, potential damage to neural thread receptors. And if we don't fire it at all? They fire on us first, said Malric. That settled it. Begin quiet phase activation. No external power trace. Use geothermal bleed for startup and route subcommand through Arctic Relay 3. Teship blinked. We're activating Aegis? We're not lighting it, Rovan replied. We're warming the match. The command relayed through secure neural interface. Across buried bunkers and C-core facilities, dormant antimatter reactors began minor load cycling, their stabilizers spinning in silence below mountains and ice sheets. Inside the bunker, the shift in atmosphere was imperceptible to machines, but not to men. The cold no longer bit. It braced. What if they detect the energy bleed? Asked Carr, tension slipping into his throat. They won't, Rovan said, stepping toward the observation alcove and triggering the uplink to orbital feed. Their attention is still fixed on city grids. They're waiting for riots, they're looking for mobs, fire, panic, things they can interpret from their archives. But Earth hasn't done what they expected, Malric said. Not yet. Above them, the feed cycled through the Concorde's main formation. Tetra carriers held steady. Strike frigates formed vertical stacks over lunar orbit. The fleet remained poised, unaware that its coordination rested on a filament thinner than its pride. In the Concorde flagship's war chamber, Strategist Volksarn surveyed Earth's surface through a convex overlay, an arrogant smile crawling up the edge of his mouth. They've restored power, one of his aides announced. I see that, Sarn replied, motioning to enhance city illumination zones. Their redundancy protocols are less primitive than anticipated. Irrelevant. They'll cave the moment we deploy mass suppression. He tapped the command feed. Prepare Phase 1 rod dispersal. His screen flickered. Static burned through 3-quadrant overlays, briefly replacing orbital visuals with inverted planetary code. He blinked. Reset that channel. Before the technician could answer, the flagship's primary display lost definition, replaced by an error that none of them recognized. Back on Earth, inside the Greenland bunker, Rovan watched as the first transmission pulse from Aegis warped the edge of the Concorde's neural bandwidth reconnaissance. He leaned forward, his eyes locked to the pattern distortion. Let them laugh. The tachyon threads were now in view. Rotate the field coils 4 degrees west. If it bleeds past the envelope, it'll burn through the lower stratosphere before we even blink. Technician Valanjor barked the order through a throat raw from recycled bunker air. Below his boots, the core chamber pulsed a steady reddish blue through the reinforced glass. The antimatter stabilizers had moved from standby to ignition sync, each movement calibrated in complete isolation from Earth's public energy grid. General Rovan Marek stood above the chamber in the observatory ring, arms locked behind his back, jaw rigid. Through the blast-shielded viewing arc, distant auroras fractured unnaturally, smeared into thin green-gray lines. Ionized sky disrupted by deep quantum turbulence below the cloud layer. He didn't speak yet. Not to the men setting up the most dangerous power exchange Earth had ever risked, nor to the tactical officers lining up relay confirmers across 3 continents. His attention lingered on the reactor's mirrored surface. A breath from instability, a breath from history. Behind him, Kardethan entered, stripped of his outer coat, sweat layered thick beneath the collar of his reinforced suit. His voice was low, unshaken. West Pole facility just completed phase lock. All 3 rings are aligned. If we hit the relay with full emission, the pulse will detonate across their tachyon structure before they can recalibrate. Margin of error? Less than we're comfortable with, but still in range. Rovan didn't nod. He studied the control loop, watching the syncrate balance drop from green to yellow. It meant the window for intervention had begun shrinking. From the lower deck, Malric Vone called up through the comport. We've mapped all conquered ship paths. They're maintaining rigid formations. Still clustered, still confident. Rovan turned away from the reactor. It means they haven't detected Aegis. Malik's voice stayed steady. Then we're ahead. Now. Rovan exhaled slowly, voice nearly flat. We're cornered, and they don't know we still have teeth. In the adjacent chamber, Teshik Dre aligned the transmitter grid, calibrating the directional spike that would carry the tachyon disruption through the satellite relay. The math wasn't theoretical anymore. It was about reaction time, sequence tolerances, and whether the team could fire fast enough to fracture a fleet before it crushed cities under orbital rods. Teshik double-checked the buffer spacing, fingers shaking slightly as he adjusted the thermal regulators under the conduit. If the pulse missed, or if it overlapped with Earth's weather pattern disruptions, they could burn the relay net for good. No second attempt. Rovan, Teshik said through the direct link. This isn't a bluff. Once we light it, we can't walk it back. I know. And it won't just be them watching. Every species with a comm relay within 6 systems will know what we did. Then we better win fast. Rovan walked toward the main control node, a table recessed into the center of the platform, surrounded by emission indicators. Each light pulsed in sequence, slowly narrowing as global confirmation pings returned from Arctic, deep sea, and desert command centers. The final light blinked green. All assets stood ready. He stared at the transmitter. One command would push the signal directly into Concord frequencies. One word, no explanation, no theatrics. Thought about the implications. Not from politics. He had never cared for the shallow posturing of Earth's fragmented leadership councils. But about whether this was retaliation or instigation. If this broadcast lit the fuse of a war Earth wasn't meant to survive, would history say they chose to burn first? Car moved closer, waiting. Malric and Teshik appeared on the upper platform, eyes fixed on the screen. The seconds passed. The room's quiet was not comfort. It was a suffocating countdown inside each man's ribs. Rovan tapped the transmission input. His fingerprint confirmed identity. The broadcast cued. The cursor blinked once. He leaned into the console mic. Proceed. The signal ripped through the relay in less than a second, spliced directly into the Concorde's fleet-wide data stream. Above Earth, strategist Volk Sarn froze as the word overrode his fleet's encrypted mainframe. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't distorted. It was intentional. He spun toward the control operator. Was that a rebroadcast error? No, the aide stammered. That was injected through our own communications web. Sarn's eyes narrowed. Did they just taunt us? He pulled up the orbital visuals. Earth remained lit. Power had never faltered. No panic had spilled into the streets. No desperate transmissions pleaded for delay. Instead, a single word had arrived. Clear, deliberate. Not surrender, not negotiation. A trigger. Begin rod deployment, he snapped. Enough observation. The Concorde's capital ships began realigning. Kinetic deployment bays opened along each hull's length, releasing containment seals around payload rods the size of city blocks. Hundreds of them, built for impact dispersion, seismic collapse, psychological trauma. On Earth, sensors flared red across command nodes. Orbital interceptors marked targets. Civilian sectors were among the coordinates. Carr whispered, "They're starting." Rovan said nothing. He walked toward the observation port. Outside, the sky had darkened. Not from weather, but from shadow geometry cast by the Concorde's formations. Clouds warped around, descending cold fronts. A flicker of heat lightning split the sky over Scandinavia. Temperature drops had begun, pulled down by the kinetic shock preparation overhead. Inside the bunker, technicians moved without pause. Final alignment. Targeting cross-check. Core synchronization countdown. Tessic looked to Rovan. Ready? Rovan's gaze held steady. His words were colder than the ice around them. Begin final sequence. No voices followed, and the sound of operators leaning forward, tracking the seconds that would decide Earth's survival. At exactly 18 o'clock UTC, deep beneath the Arctic shelf, Valanjor's fingers released the last safety latch. A resonant thrumming surged through the reinforced conduits, a low-frequency vibration that set every metal brace in the chamber trembling. Rovan Merrick watched on the observation portal as the reactor core's glow intensified, radiating a dull crimson bloom behind glass thick enough to withstand continental bombardment. "Aegis is live," Valen announced, voice taut enough to crack. He pressed a gloved palm to his headset microphone, and the transmission crackled across Earth's command network. From mobile units sprawled across Siberia and the Gobi, in deep-sea vaults off Sumatra and the Andes' hidden bunkers, operators confirmed readiness. Satellite relays registered full power coupling. Ground stations registered shear-wave oscillations rolling through bedrock 500 meters below. "On my mark," Rovan said, eyes fixed on the timer overlaid on the feed. 7, 6. He breathed in the sterile chill of the control room. Air recycled through microfilters that carried no hint of dust or chemical burn, only the weight of anticipation. Behind him, cables wove against concrete walls, tracking relays and pointing conduits like blood vessels. 3, 2. Balin's glove flicked a switch. The core chamber blinked from crimson to white-hot glare as antimatter containment fields modulated upward. Graph lines flickered on the heads-up readouts, showing a tachyon frequency curve climbing beyond design parameters. 1, 0. A jagged shockwave ripped through lunar orbit. In the war chamber of the Concorde flagship, strategist Volk Sarn's reflection fractured across a curved window as the tachyon pulse struck every relay node simultaneously. For a moment, time itself seemed to skip. A flicker across every display, every tactical projection misaligned, Back on Earth, Rovan exhaled, but his expression remained composed. Engage drones, he ordered. Moments later, the sky above Shanghai and Rio de Janeiro bore witness to fiery plumes. Hypersonic interceptors, slung from orbital platforms disguised as communications satellites, sliced through the thin atmosphere to meet descending landing craft. The ground shuddered with sonic booms that rattled windows and sent dust plumes marching through deserted streets. In lunar orbit, 32 Concorde vessels collided like icebergs on a storm-churned sea. Their hulls groaned, shields ruptured, and entire wings tore free. Multitudes of debris cascaded toward the far side of the moon, where glinting fragments carved new pockmarks on its surface. 30% of the armada lay in ruined heaps, drifting without control. On the command decks of surviving ships, officers staggered under the rupture of their tachyon matrix. Control nodes sparked, screens flickered between operational data and fatal error codes. Communication lines fractured, leaving captains shouting in darkness they could neither see nor navigate. Volksarn's voice cut through the chaos, measured but raw. Status report. A junior officer crouched before a fractured relay terminal, the console's lights sputtering like a broken heartbeat. Coordination arrays at 60% failure. Rings 1 through 3 are offline. We're blind in Sector Delta. Sarn's jaw clenched. Divert power to secondary thrusters. Attempt manual sync. Negative. Auxiliary relays are overloaded. He slammed his fist against the command podium. The impact echoed like a drumbeat. Then we adapt. Meanwhile, in Greenland's relay pit, Rovan watched the orbital collapse unfold in real time. His team's faces glowed from the monitor's light, etched with awe and relief. Malric Vone tapped a sequence on the central table. They won't get a second strike in this window, Malric observed. Their kinetic rods cannot be retargeted fast enough. They're blind, and gravity will do the rest. Deploy interceptor sweeps, Rovan said, voice low but urgent, and prepare the secondary pulse in case they start manual detonation. Below them, the hum of emergency ventilation grew louder as systems rerouted power to life support backups. The air tasted sterile, but carried a trace of warmed circuitry, an electric tang awakening every nerve in their bodies. Operators at remote stations guided hypersonic interceptors through flight corridors. Trajectories were adjusted in real time to intersect descending landing craft, their magnesium flares shattering as railgun bursts punched through armor plating. Engines groaned and fell silent, debris sprayed outward in incandescent showers. In the midst of triumph, Rovan sensed the shift in weight. It wasn't victory. It was the moment when an adversary understood that force alone wasn't enough. He turned to Malric. They taught war, he murmured, voice barely above a breath. We learned consequence. Malric nodded, eyes flickering to the shattered lines of the Concorde fleet. It's the first lesson that cuts deeper than any rod. Rovan didn't answer. He returned to the portal, studying the blank spaces where ships once stood. The lunar horizon glowed with tendrils of ionized debris, drifting in fractal patterns. Through his visor, he saw the distant blackness of space refracted across the shattered formation. Behind him, the bunker's walls thrummed as auxiliary reactors synchronized back to standby. The tension in the room lifted slightly, but Rovan remained rooted. He keyed a secure comlink. All units, hold position. Prepare for potential retaliation. On the other end, voices crackled with resolve. Acknowledged, came Selric's calm reply from the Sol node. We anticipate countermeasures. Rovan's gaze returned to the feed. In the conquered flagship's war room, Sarn's aides argued beneath flickering lights, their unity fractured. Some called for withdrawal, others clamored for a demonstrative second wave. All operated in the blind. Rovan switched off the comm. He walked to the central table, where the heads-up display showed global power status recovering. Cities flickered back to full brightness. Neural thread networks recalibrated, and emergency shelters stood empty. He stared at his reflection in the glass. Sweat glistened on his forehead. but his posture was steady, face unmoved. Outside, Arctic wind gusted against the bunker's outer shell, rattling the vents as if applauding. He turned to his team. Today, they learned that consequence can be engineered. They exchanged looks of understanding, relief, and unspoken pride. The room's bright glow dimmed as systems scaled back. Operations shifted from attack mode to consolidation. Rovan raised a hand. Begin data harvest. We'll need every byte from their relays. As the team moved to secure captured enemy data, Rovan pressed his palm to the observation glass one last time. Smoke trails wove across the lunar sky like broken veins, a testament to the power swing that had just occurred. He whispered to no one in particular, but every man in that room heard it. They taught war. We learned consequence. At 1910 UTC, a signal blinked alive from the UDC Arctic uplink array. It spread quietly, threaded through diplomatic relay frequencies, Concord's auxiliary comm spectrum, and every unmanned satellite that had survived the first exchange. No encryption. No threats. Only imagery. Burning wreckage in lunar orbit. Hulls split into drifting carcasses. Concord command cruisers listing sideways, scorched at their flanks, venting debris in slow arcs. A compilation of destruction, each second drawn from enemy feeds, stitched together into a looping broadcast, engineered for psychological detonation. Rovan Merrick watched the feed in silence from the control room, arms folded as the footage cycled again. Melrick Vone stood near the comm node, jaw locked. Teshik Drell tapped in audio modulation, splicing in a low male voice with deliberate cadence. You demanded submission. We offer you memory. The voice didn't bark. It didn't echo. It sat level in the ear. Neutral, cold, undeniable. A simple narrative placed beside their own failure. The loop began again, frame by frame. From his mobile command unit, Rovan shifted toward the sound console. What's their expected response? Tessick didn't answer immediately. His eyes danced over intercepted frequencies as if reading static for meaning. He finally looked up. They can't unsee it. This footage came from their own ships. The moment it plays back inside their own command bridges, it becomes self-documentation. They don't just see loss. They experience betrayal of competence. Malrick's tone was quieter now. It's worse than shame. It's reflection. By 1935 UTC, UDC analysts reported unusual packet loops originating from at least 4 Concord species. Signals bouncing without clear destination, bouncing back mid-transmission, like failed attempts at synchronization. Tessick adjusted the bandwidth filters, isolating comms from the Zalari and the Brock-2 mid-tier military contributors within the Alliance. They're arguing, he confirmed. One accused the primary fleet of engineering a trap, said Earth was luring them on purpose. The reply didn't even address it. It redirected blame to cultural misalignment. Rovan's expression tightened. When they stop believing their superiors are competent, the collapse isn't structural, it's mental. Tessick nodded. They thought we were fractured. That assumption just flipped. Inside the Concord flagship, Volk Sarn paced the length of the central war deck, a thick bandage wrapped around his left forearm. Sparks crackled from a fractured ceiling conduit, and half his interface panels had failed to reboot. The fleet's nerve center, once immaculate, now looked like a bunker that had seen its own funeral. Around him, sub-commanders barked partial data at one another, each trying to re-establish a version of order. Sarn raised a hand. Broadcast suppression, he snapped. I want that Earth transmission blocked across all vessels. One officer turned, his expression uncertain. We tried. They embedded the signal into the diplomatic relay cascade. If we cut it, we also sever internal comms across 7 fleet segments. Sarn's jaw flexed. Then find a workaround, redirect bandwidth, overwrite civilian channels. They used our own archives. The video is flagged as friendly telemetry. It overrides system filters by default. The strategist's hand balled into a fist. Then scrub it manually. It would require vessel-by-vessel deletion. He said nothing for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped to a tone more dangerous than shouting. If I hear that message again, I'll decommission every technician on this deck. At 2010 UTC on Earth's side, UDC intercepted a direct command string from a Kalari cruiser, an order to pull back from bombardment readiness. 23 minutes later, a Tershak ground battalion requested permission to disengage from orbital descent. Neither command had been authorized by Concorde's Central Fleet. Tessic isolated the timestamp. They're breaking protocol. Rovan leaned in. Are they doing it to preserve strength or to distance themselves from what's coming? Malik answered without hesitation. Both, but neither helps Sarn. At 2050, 5 more species rerouted internal supply lines without flagging Concorde priority code. The signals were subtle, disguised as emergency reroutes, but they all funneled away from battle groups still committed to the front. By 21:00 UTC, a scout relay from the Southern Pacific Node confirmed 3 landing craft had self-aborted re-entry and returned to their carrier decks. No contact, no excuse, just reversal. Rovan turned toward the overhead screen showing the lunar fleet's remaining structure. Concorde ships no longer moved as one. Gaps widened in formation. Command pathways fractured. Some capital ships held position, others drifted. Confused, unsure, waiting for instructions from voices they no longer trusted. Rovan finally broke the stillness. Prepare the secondary pulse. Mallorik stiffened. Now? Not yet. I want it armed and isolated. This time we don't fire for damage. We fire for confirmation. Tessic frowned. Meaning? We'll time it with their next command relay, right as they try to reorganize. Let them think Earth isn't waiting for the right shot. We already took it and are choosing not to fire again. Malrik stepped forward, his boots clacking against the deck's insulation grates. Psychological misalignment. Internal freeze. It'll push those on the edge over the threshold. Tessic reached for the console. Secondary pulse arming now. Emission will be dormant until triggered. Outside the Arctic bunker, snow began to fall. Thick, dry flakes brushing against the observation dome's reinforced outer shell. Inside, every man remained at station, not because of order, but because none of them were willing to leave the moment they'd waited decades to prepare for. The feed continued to loop, flames trailing off Concorde command holes. Internal footage showing captains shouting into non-responsive consoles. And always, always, the voice beneath it. You demanded submission. We offer you memory. By the end of that hour, 6 more species had issued internal withdrawal protocols. None informed Concorde's Central Command. Rovan stood in the center of the room, eyes drawn to a lone data stream flowing differently from the others. One Concorde battleship still maneuvering closer, still armed, still aligned. He tapped the console to tag it. We've removed their coordination. Now we start removing their belief. And no one disagreed. At 22:59 UTC, a tremor registered across the upper orbital bands. It was not seismic, nor caused by atmospheric imbalance. The satellite relay systems picked up coordinated payload releases, clustered kinetic rods accelerating in staggered patterns toward Earth's gravity well. Within 3 seconds, the Concorde fleet committed to full bombardment. 700 ships, stripped of unity but fueled by spite, launched their strike simultaneously. The rods fell like rigid thunderbolts, each weighing multiple tons, stripped of guidance systems, yet still catastrophic if unchecked. Inside Earth's orbital control bunker, buried under the snow-packed ridges of northern Greenland, Rovan Marek issued a single command. Wake the array. R. Dethen keyed into the global defense system. Civilian communications satellites flickered offline as hidden weapon platforms initialized. External shells shedding like brittle skin to reveal gunmetal black artillery arms. Mass reactive railguns, dormant for over 2 decades, rotated in cold silence. Their targeting systems locked into rods, descending at terminal velocity. Operators shouted data points across the floor. Overlays displayed impact vectors. Seattle, Tianjin, Frankfurt, Buenos Aires. They came for industrial arteries, not capitals. First sweep. Fire, ordered Malric Vone. The sky above Earth lit up, not in fire, but in kinetic defiance. Rail slugs streaked upward in arcs that burned white against the high atmosphere, each colliding mid-air with a descending rod. The force of impact split them apart before atmospheric entry, disintegrating them into dust and streaks of slag. Over 20 major strikes were intercepted in under a minute. Still, a few broke through. One slammed into the outer shipping yards of Lagos. Concrete liquefied. Shockwaves sent steel hulls flying like paper folded in the wind. Another tore through the outskirts of Sao Paulo's logistics corridor, kicking up ash columns taller than office towers. Inside the Arctic Command, no one flinched. The battle wasn't decided by isolated strikes. It would be shaped by the collapse of their cohesion. Rovan walked toward the outer deck door. He passed rows of personnel running live ops, each with sleeves rolled, eyes wide, skin slick with the sweat of decision. The smell of synthetic rubber mixed with coolant oil lingered in the recycled air. "Bring up Siberian ground feed," he instructed. Tessic Drell routed visual data from the low-orbit scout drones overhead. A tactical feed zoomed onto a frozen stretch outside Krasnoyarsk where Concord scout teams had deployed by drop capsule just before the pulse. The aliens moved with rigid efficiency, quad-legged troopers armed with retractable glaives and microcharged detonators. What they didn't expect was Earth's neural-linked infantry. 10 Terran soldiers moved through the tree line, suits camouflaged to match frozen bark. Their exosuits weren't just armor, they were extensions of thought, tuned to muscle impulses before they fully formed. The lead trooper crouched, braced his gauntlet against the snow, and launched a magnetic spike through the center mass of the alien vanguard. In less than 90 seconds, the entire Concord unit lay scattered across the ice. Not a single human had fallen. "Same result in the Pacific," Malaric reported. Scout waves terminated within local zones, minimal human exposure. Drones handled the flanks. Rovan stepped onto the deck as the reinforced door hissed open behind him. Snow blew sideways across the overlook, carried by wind that bit through his suit like frost-laced glass. His boots crunched against the packed layer beneath. He didn't blink against the cold. The aurora had vanished, replaced by falling debris, streaks of vapor trails, and flashes of failed burns. Orbital fragments dotted the upper sky like torn shrapnel falling through ink. "Trigger secondary Aegis pulse," he said over the comlink. Malric hesitated. "You want it full strength?" "No, detune it. We're not breaking them again. We're erasing their sight." Teskik acknowledged the order. EMP layering loaded. Target, Fleet's signal core. Inside the control room, Aegis pulsed to life again. This time without announcing itself. The pulse ripped silently across space in under half a second. No shockwave, no visual fanfare. But the result was immediate. Every remaining Concorde ship's optical feed died. Internal lighting systems failed. Navigation cores reset to basic cycle. Reactor subsystems stalled, unable to distinguish direction or hierarchy. Command lines vanished from their internal UI. On the Concorde flagship, Sarn's crew clutched at rails as artificial gravity warped momentarily. The primary display turned to black. No data, no orientation, no external vision. One officer whispered the unthinkable. "We've lost the grid." Sarn didn't answer. He couldn't. his voice stuck behind his clenched jaw. Eyes wide as feedback alarms screamed in languages no one could decipher without working visual aids. His command bridge was now a coffin, drifting through darkness. On Earth, inside the Arctic relay station, the operators confirmed each loss of signal. Rovan remained on the deck, hands at his sides, watching the sky twist with fragments and frozen wreckage. The pulse had taken hold. The enemy still floated above, but they no longer had context, direction, or coordination. "Fleet is blind," Malric confirmed, stepping out beside him. "They'll lash out," Rovan replied. "Out of instinct. Then they won't hit anything that matters." Below them, alert stations across the globe shifted to final containment procedures. Civilian sectors were cleared, interceptor drones repositioned, recovery teams launched toward impact zones already cooling under nightfall. Rovan turned, stepping back into the bunker as wind slammed the door behind him. His breath clouded in the transition chamber before the warmth of the command center reclaimed him. Tashik looked up. "They've begun internal signal loops. Blind ships trying to talk to other blind ships." Malric keyed in a final sequence. "And now the spiral feeds on itself." "They're not retreating," Carr said, scanning the upper grid. "They're not attacking. They're stalling in panic." "They've already lost," Rovan replied. Then he walked to the central console, tapped a fresh overlay of the disabled Concorde fleet, and locked eyes with his team. "Send the message." At 23:10 UTC, Rovan Malric stepped back into the primary comms bay. The cold of the observation deck still clung to his collar, the fibers of his uniform rigid with frost. The bunker's interior buzzed with quiet friction. Rubber soles scraping tile, gloves brushing over circuit panels. Low murmurs traded between operators, but no one raised their voice. All screens showed the same thing: a fleet with no eyes, orbiting without function, drifting without purpose. The Concorde ships held position out of inertia, not intent. Tessic Drill stood near the uplink chamber, reviewing the decrypted transmission packets. His face bore a tightness that hadn't loosened since the first rods fell. "They're splintering faster than we estimated," he said. "Subfactions running independent channel codes. We've confirmed 4 ships blocking Concorde relay commands outright." Malric Vone leaned forward from the mission node table. "That means they've severed hierarchy." Rovan scanned the current orbital display. Movement patterns resembled a storm of retreating flocks, clusters of ships pivoting slowly away from their central anchor. The command carrier still floated at the center, but the constellation it once led had lost all symmetry. "I turned fear into doctrine," Rovan said, "and now that fear's facing the mirror." Tashik pulled up the final transmission sequence, one that had been queued but not yet released. A full data vault, time-stamped, authenticated, and embedded with unaltered copies of Concorde deliberations across 19 council sessions. "This is what we send next," Tessic said. "No commentary, just raw." Hardethan stepped in from the outer corridor, wiping ash dust off his boots, residue still falling from a rod strike intercepted above the Atlantic shipping lanes. "They'll deny it," he muttered. "They'll call it deep fake warfare." "They can try," Rovan replied, "but when their own fleet's recognition systems verify the voice prints and confirm the chain of custody hashes, denial turns into delay." He moved to the control panel, pressed his hand to the authorization plate, and activated the sequence. The data vault transmitted through the back-channel Concorde communications grid, automated to trigger every vessel's public protocol logs. It was clean, undisguised, impossible to spin. Inside the Concorde flagship, strategist Volksarn watched as the first report appeared on his fractured display. A file tagged Session 3417, then Session 3432. One by one, Council vote logs spilled across the interface. Debates in which Earth's danger was overstated, dissenting species were silenced. Voices once buried returned in unfiltered clarity. One counselor had asked, "Is Earth's tech leap truly incompatible with interstellar stability?" Another replied, "Even if it isn't, fear is enough." Sarn's eyes narrowed. His hands gripped the edge of the console hard enough that his gloves creaked. Around him, the command staff shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. No one reached for the comms panel. Every officer had frozen, not by order, but from the weight of recognition. Then the incoming transmissions began, fragmented, angry, too many to block. On the secondary monitor, a fleet captain from the Broctoon species appeared, voice distorted through raw uplink compression. You knew Earth hadn't initiated hostilities. You knew they never fired first. Another voice, this time a Zelari logistics director, cracked the neck. You promised their defenses were theoretical. You claimed their AI systems lacked broadcast synchronization. You lied. Sarn tried to counter. The threat remained. You saw what they did. They did what you forced, came the reply. You voted to strike before they even achieved outer orbit parity. This wasn't preemptive, this was suppression. Within 5 minutes, 8 of the remaining 23 Concorde fleets began jamming all transmissions from Sarn's command ship, not externally, internally. His own allies no longer recognized his authority. Inside Earth's command hub, Tessic Drell monitored the surge. "They've cut him off," he said. "His own allied fleets are quarantining his signal block." Melrick looked up from the impact zone chart. "Mutiny?" "Worse," Rovan answered. "Recognition collapse. It's no longer who leads, it's whether the leadership structure ever had legitimacy to begin with." Carr tapped in a radar burst. "We're getting fleet-wide path deviations. Ships are pulling away. Breaking formation, shifting orbital lanes." At 23:33 UTC, one of the Concord interceptors launched a message of its own. Earth satellites received it unedited. The message was short. "We acknowledge our error, we disengage." By 23:45 UTC, Volksarn stood alone on the dimmed bridge of a flagship with no fleet. The last of his command staff departed through the emergency hatches, rerouting into escape modules that fled toward the nearest independent carriers. No one addressed him. No one saluted. He stood in the middle of the dark, surrounded by dormant interfaces, the voices of betrayal looping in his comm buffer. On Earth, the skies shifted. From northern hemisphere observatories to desert relay arrays, all eyes turned upward. What once was an armada now looked like scattered remnants. Ships veering off in separate directions, some blinking into hyperspace, others moving into decommissioned drift. In the Arctic command post, no one cheered. There were no celebrations. The weight of survival never came with music. Rovan stepped out of the room. He moved through the passage without his coat, each breath fogging into the cold. The outer deck welcomed him with the hiss of pressurization withdrawal. Snow whipped against the reinforced windows as he stood beneath the flickering upper atmosphere glow. The lights weren't auroras. They were the dying trails of propulsion heat signatures, stretched thin across thinning cloud layers. Behind him, static buzzed faintly from the interior comm channel. Earth systems had returned to standby. Monitoring had resumed. But no orders came. He looked to the sky once more. No formations. No coordination. Only debris. And ships abandoning a lie that cost them everything. By 200 UTC, every orbital threat had cleared Earth's skies. Fragments still traced arcs through the upper atmosphere, glowing faintly as they decayed and disappeared. The last Concorde vessel vanished beyond sensor range just before sunrise over the equator. Earth was no longer a battlefield. It was what remained. The casualty report arrived shortly after. 1,217,408 confirmed dead. Shanghai's eastern corridor lay in blackout. Lagos still smoldered from the cratered refinery block. Medical triage tents were raised from scorched stadiums, cargo cranes repurposed to pull debris from residential zones. Inside the Arctic Command facility, Rovan Marek read the names of the fallen. He didn't assign blame. He didn't call for vengeance. He memorized a few of the youngest listed, then deleted the file from his interface. No speech would undo them. The only thing worth saying had already been said. By 300 UTC, international leaders began issuing statements. They praised unity, spoke of sacrifice, broadcast resolve. Each word carefully measured by advisors, translated into 6 dozen languages, pushed across neural feeds and broadcast towers. None would be remembered. At 3:20 UTC, a single camera powered on inside the Arctic deck, the signal routed through UDC's satellite web, uninterrupted and unedited. No music, no backdrop, no national flags, only a reinforced blast wall and one man. Rovan stood in front of the uplink transmitter, in the same uniform he'd worn through the entire siege. His knuckles were raw from the wind, one eye slightly bloodshot. He didn't posture. He didn't flint. They counted minutes, he said, each word deliberate. We counted consequences. He left the transmission live for 20 seconds after speaking. No additional message followed. The feed cut on silence. The world didn't erupt in applause. It listened. Within the week, 14 conquered-aligned species formally severed diplomatic ties with the High Council. Their exit declarations cited deliberate manipulation of intelligence, violation of neutrality protocols, and ethical failure. 3 fleets refused to return to Council territory and rerouted to independent systems. A trade corridor near the Telsari Rim shut down permanently. Minor skirmishes broke out in disputed zones between dissenting conquered factions. The collapse had begun, not from military loss but ideological exposure. The illusion of collective superiority had ruptured under its own weight. On Earth, the focus shifted. Disaster relief units moved through damaged zones, retrieving survivors buried beneath concrete shells. Engineers converted subterranean shelters into temporary hospitals. Power grids were restructured to decentralize even further, modeled after the resilience Earth had weaponized during the blackout. At 5:40 UTC, the newly formed Terran Accord convened for its first global session, a collection of defense ministers, scientists, and infrastructure leaders who had coordinated survival without waiting for permission. No governments were dissolved, none were replaced, but something unspoken had changed. The old lines between allies and strangers no longer mattered. Earth had unified not under ideology, but necessity. Rovan didn't attend the ceremony. He remained in the Arctic. The Aegis reactor, now dormant, was sealed beneath 7 layers of blast shielding. The engineers who maintained it deleted their access keys and destroyed the terminal logs. The weapon would never be used again, not because Earth lacked the courage, but because it no longer needed to prove it had any. Across the orbital layer, construction teams launched framework nodes. A ring would be built, not as a weapon, but as a signal. Inside the Western anchoring module, workers began carving a phrase into the first reinforcement door. They didn't paint it. They etched it. Deep, permanent, immune to fading or orbital erosion. Proceed. No further explanation followed. Anyone who saw it already knew what it meant. Tessic Drell remained stationed at the satellite defense grid, ensuring conquered remnants didn't double back. Malric Vone joined the Accord's new strategy council, helping translate battlefield methods into lasting defense models. Rovan declined every offer of elevation. Instead, he walked alone down the edge of the Arctic ridge, following the same path he'd taken during the countdown. The snow had hardened again, wind shaping it into sharp ridges like teeth. Beneath his boots, the crust cracked softly with every step. He reached the outermost signal tower and stopped. The device was still active, broadcasting neutral tones to incoming channels, a standard beacon that no longer warned or invited. It simply existed. He looked up. No fleets. No rods. No shadows against the stars. The sky, for the first time in days, was still. He reached into his coat and removed the uplink device he had carried since the first contact transmission. Its surface was chipped, half fused from impact during the bunker tremors. He turned it over once, twice, then set it gently on the base of the tower. No ceremony, no audience, just finality. The wind shifted. A distant radar node clicked behind him as a new transmission cycled through. He ignored it. His breath fogged briefly as he whispered the last words of a war that never declared itself, but had ended all the same. They gave us midnight, we gave them memory. Then he turned and walked back through the snow. Alone, unguarded, finished.